Motions are raw, passions running high after the leak of this draft opinion that apparently shows a majority of the highest court may be poised to overturn Roe v. Wade, but there are still plenty of unknowns on the legal side of this question. And when we have questions about the law, we often turn to our next guest. Paul Berman is a professor of law at the George Washington University School of Law. Professor, first of all, it's great to have you with us. I'm 3 decades plus around here. I've never seen anything like this. Have you?
Certainly the idea of leaking an opinion in draft form before it's ever come out is something that we've never seen at the Supreme Court. So that's unprecedented. But I think we also need to focus on the opinion itself, which is a radical, maximalist takedown of decades of settled jurisprudence on the court, basically just because the composition of the court has changed. And this is a group of justices who, most of whom were appointed by presidents who didn't win the popular vote and confirmed by senators who collectively didn't represent a majority of the popular vote. And so we're really seeing a kind of counter-majoritarian, anti-democratic lock-in of the most radical sort on the court right now, and I'm not sure that we've seen anything like this since the period before the New Deal.
The executive and the legislative branches have always been, it's a food fight in the best of times there, but the Supreme Court has been sort of above that now. But you get the feeling that it's just as messy there as it has been any place, across the street in Congress or maybe down the street over at the White House, that it can be a street fight as well. And when you look at the language of this thing, this isn't just couched in legalese. This is out and out strident, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's framed as a culture war, and I think the last few justices that have been appointed see themselves as warriors in a culture war. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that the Supreme Court looks like just a political institution engaged in a culture war, that is deadly for the institutional legitimacy of the court, because the Supreme Court doesn't have its own police force, it doesn't have its own army. It only functions if we believe and are willing to follow what the Supreme Court says. To the extent that this is hurting the court's long-term institutional legitimacy, which I think it is, that's another blow to liberal democracy as we know it.
The Chief Justice has ordered an investigation. My question is just exactly how thorough of an investigation is it likely to be? Because what it does is it suddenly shines a light on what goes on behind those closed doors and in those the big room where they sit around and debate these things, and there's horse trading that goes on in opinion, just like there are in congressional chambers. But it's the Supreme Court again. It's different. But now all of a sudden, it doesn't look all that different than everything else.
And I think that, again, when the court looks like it's just making political decisions because 5 justices happen to believe something and the composition of the court has changed, and when they're willing to unseat settled expectations, which, by the way, go way beyond abortion. The way this opinion is written, it would challenge lots of privacy rights, rights to contraception, rights to sexual relations in the privacy of one's own home, that we have taken for granted and that we think of as fundamental are now up for grabs. And when the court does that just because there are 5 justices willing to vote one way versus the other, it really exposes the court to criticism that it's just a political entity and that there's no particular reason in believing in the rule of law as a concept that is separate from politics. And that's really deadly and devastating to any kind of liberal democracy.
This draft is dated February, and then the actual day is left out of 2022. Is it likely this is, if not the final version a later version and one that's liable to look an awful lot like whatever that final majority opinion is, if in fact it follows this line, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. Opinions do change during the drafting process, and different other justices might ask for changes to the draft, so we don't really know what stage this is in. But I will say that leaking this opinion makes it, I think, less likely that the other justices that we assume are joining this opinion can change it. Because if it gets watered down or if it gets changed in any way, everyone will know that it's been changed. And so in some sense, it really suits Justice Alito's purposes to have this opinion, the way he drafted it, be public, because it makes it harder to change it.
Galvanizes the whatever the 5 or however many votes it winds up getting.
It freezes, it solidifies that majority and freezes them in place by releasing it to the public, whereas maybe they might have said, oh, you know, could we water this down a little bit, or could we couch this a little bit, or could you take out these 2 paragraphs, or that kind of thing. That now becomes harder.
Is this a line of demarcation after which everything at least is viewed differently by the American public, do you think?
Well, I think the first step was Bush versus Gore, when the Supreme Court entered into a political battle it didn't need to enter into, and issued a decision that was very, very hard to justify on any grounds other than partisanship by a 5-4 vote to determine the presidential election of 2000. And ever since then, people have started referring to justices as either Democrats or Republicans, which is a problem. This is going to greatly accelerate that process, because it really does look as if it's just about what 5 justices happen to believe from a culture war, social theory kind of point of view, and really having nothing to do with the idea that law should be constant and predictable over time, or that law should be based on larger principles of constitutional meaning. And so I think that this is going to expose the court even more to the criticism that it's just a political institution. And as I said, I think that's deadly to the long-term health of our democracy. And it's part of locking in kind of permanent minority rule. And so it goes along with things like the Electoral College and the composition of the Senate and partisan gerrymandering and voter suppression and so forth, because this is all about locking in the preferences of a minority of Americans as the country as a whole becomes more and more progressive.
Does it also open the door potentially for wider membership, more justices? There are 9. What's to say that at some point there couldn't be 11 or 13 or pick a number?
There's certainly nothing in the Constitution that designates that 9 is the magic number, and it has changed during the history of the country. And I think, you know, this is a moment where clearly the Republicans have packed the court. They denied Barack Obama a selection. They rushed through Amy Coney Barrett when really that should have been President Biden's selection. So they've packed the court, and it is that group that is now behind this kind of radical decision. So I think that it will galvanize even more attention to the question of whether the court as a whole needs some reform in order to right that anti-democratic balance.
Paul Berman, law professor at George Washington University, and a guy to whom we turn in times just like these, and we appreciate it. Many thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Live look outside the Supreme Court right now. We are keeping a close eye on what's going on up there, and we will go back there from time to time. We've got a lot more for you this afternoon. We're back right after this.